On the pod today, we have in studio Congresswoman-elect from the 45th District of California, Katie Porter.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
We were all so excited.
Yeah, no, we were thrilled too, and so were all of our volunteers and supporters, and it took a couple weeks to get a final answer.
You had fantastic volunteers and supporters as someone who had been down to the district a little bit. So I think you pulled off one of the most difficult wins in the country, because not only were you running in a district that has voted Republican since it's been created, but you ran as a proud progressive, Medicare for all, assault weapons ban, Elizabeth Warren protege. You obviously got quite a few Romney Republicans to vote for you, probably got a few Trump Republicans to vote for you as well. What was your pitch to those voters, and what did you hear from those voters when you were trying to get their votes?
When we talked to voters who maybe had voted Republican historically in the past, maybe they'd even voted for President Trump, we would talk with them about the issues that mattered to them. And so there were a lot of folks who voted for the president and thought, well, maybe it'll work out. And it's not really working out. And so there were people who just felt like a course correction was needed. I think we were also really careful to emphasize that I spent my career studying issues, that I'm thoughtful, that I'm willing to listen. And we're really working on making that come true in terms of how we're setting up our district office and creating ways to engage with constituents. Because my most important audience right now is not those who voted for me, it's those who didn't vote for me.
Right.
And so this next couple of months, really trying to think about how to reach out to those people, invite them to come listen to me or to meet me.
Did you notice, I talked to a lot of voters over the course of the campaign, did some focus groups for another pod that I did, and I noticed that even with the Obama-Trump voters, on issues, they tend to be open to more progressive ideas. Then when you talk to them about sort of Washington, the tone in Washington, they were much more like, people should cooperate more, there's too much yelling. And these would be people who voted for Trump who were saying, I think I want Medicare for all. Like, did you notice that when you were talking to folks?
Yeah, look, Orange County and the part of Orange County that I'm going to be representing, it's a place that really values civility. It's a really educated population. And so these are people who are interested in ideas. They're interested in debate. And so when we talk about things like an assault weapon ban, I'll get people who will tell me about the definition of an assault weapon. I'll get people who will explain that it's really about gun death by suicide that we ought to be tackling. And so what they want is someone who's really thinking with them and engaging with them. And I think that when you talk about ideas, people are quite progressive. I think when you ask them about their kind of party politics, that's where historically in Orange County, that's just a question you don't ask. Asking someone, what party are you, or how do you vote? Are you a Democrat? That's like asking, is that a car a lease? How much money do you make? These are just not questions that we ask in polite company. And so I think in this election, one of the things we tried to do was to make space for people to start talking about their issues and their values, and then to slowly begin to translate that into political action.
So last time we spoke, you told me that you were most excited about the prospect of becoming a congresswoman because you really want to write laws and dig into policies. And I saw a report that some progressives think you should get a seat on the House Financial Services Committee, which oversees banks, lenders, and insurance companies. What specifically would you like to dig into when the new Congress starts?
Yeah, so the first priority for me, as it is for so many of my new freshman colleagues, is campaign finance reform. And that's in part because without taking some steps to solve that, it's going to be really difficult to do work on healthcare or on the environment or on financial services. But look, I've spent 20 years being a financial services nerd. I've testified before that committee.
Yeah.
I've been at the wrath of Congressman Jeb Hensarling. I'm looking forward to being on the committee. I've testified before Senate Banking. This is my life's work, is trying to think about how can we make our economy successful? How can we make sure our economy is providing opportunities for regular American families to prosper and for businesses to grow and create jobs?
Obviously, this is really tough with a Republican Senate and Donald Trump in the White House, but do you see any areas where there's a possibility for compromise and getting something done? I mean, criminal justice reform looks like it's on the path of getting passed. Are there any issues like that that you care about that you think, there might be a possibility to get something done?
Well, I think we've heard a lot about the possibility of infrastructure and bipartisan cooperation on that. I think for me personally, thinking about housing affordability and about what we're going to do to stabilize our housing markets, it's a hugely important issue in coastal Orange County and in Southern California generally, the cost of housing and how it's rising. And so I think that's an issue where groups like the Realtors, groups like the Mortgage Bankers Association, these groups typically do work across the aisle. And so whether it's working on stabilizing FHA or coming up with a plan to get our Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac out of conservatorship, where they've been lingering for
a long time now.
years. I mean, if they were a kid, they'd be almost 18 and an adult now. And so I think those are some issues that are maybe seem more technical to people, but really are long-term very important to our economy.
So as you mentioned, you've been working on these issues your whole life. You did a lot of research for Elizabeth Warren on what families go through when they go through bankruptcy for her book. You've written books on your own. Kamala Harris, when she was Attorney General, appointed you to monitor the banks and the post-crisis mortgage settlement. What did you learn from these experiences about, how we make rules that are more fair than are in place right now when it comes to how people deal with banks, creditors, financial institutions?
So I have two kind of overarching observations. One of them has to do with complexity and the way in which complexity in the law is not an accident. It's not just a byproduct that has to exist, but it's actually something that gets baked into a lot of laws as a way of making it difficult for people to make use of them. And so every time we make a law incredibly complex, and there's 16 different programs and 42 different acronyms, and by the way, you have to fax your paperwork in because, we all have a fax machine right there so handy. I saw that with the foreclosure crisis. The programs that were rolled out were really well-intentioned, but the complexity made it impossible for people to navigate. I'm dealing with this right now with healthcare. So I'm on the DC-based Affordable Care Act small business plan. This is what Congress members get. And we get a partial subsidy on the premiums, which is a real benefit. We also get a choice of 69 plans. And so I've been trying to wade through these. I've called 1-800-HELP ME like a million times. So I think that thinking about balancing trying to create laws that are fair for everybody and every little individual circumstance with the fact that then things get so complex that nobody can get help, that nobody even tries to navigate through that process. And then I think the other thing I would say from all of the work I've done with bankruptcy and with the foreclosure stuff is just how important it is when people in this country want help from their government or need help from their government, that we be ready to answer. So it's been interesting as a congressperson, you get to pick one of these correspondence management systems. Doesn't that sound like warm and friendly? And a lot of the pitches that they make are sort of like, seamlessly make your constituents disappear. And I don't want to make my constituents disappear.
This is like answering letters and calls from constituents,
and recording information from phone calls. And my goal is to actually capture that information, but to do so in a way that promotes further conversation. So if someone writes me on an issue, the letter I send back to them should invite them deeper into conversation. It shouldn't cause them to not write back again.
Thank you for writing. I'm working very hard on this.
Right. I really appreciate knowing your opinion,
best,
right? So but I think that's a mindset switch in government that we need to work on, is how do we engage people kind of not just at election time, but day in, day out as we do the work of government and make policy choices.
If you had been on Obama's economic team during those first years of the crisis, what would you have advised him to do differently than we did?
Yeah, great question. So the answer is the idea that the industry itself could self-administer all of these programs, and that they would be communicating with consumers. That was never going to work. And ultimately, it took years and years, and these programs took a very long time to get ramped up. And it was the nature of the mortgage industry that they weren't set up to deal with these problems. They were set up to take your check for the correct amount delivered before the due date out of the envelope and deposit the check. At best, That's what they know how to do.
Yeah.
And so to kind of engage in human conversations with people about complex situations. So what I would have said is, I think we needed to deliver some kind of simpler, more rough justice, but that got to people much more quickly. So one of the things we did in the National Mortgage Settlement, part of the program that I really liked, was we wrote down, just eliminated, zeroed out lots and lots and lots of second mortgages here in California on people who were deeply underwater. And literally the bank sent you a one-page letter and it said, "Hi, we're forgiving your second morgage. If you
That's
don't..."
a nice letter. That's a different kind of letter to get from a bank.
If you don't want it, call us. And I remember asking a Bank of America executive, who calls you? Who doesn't want this? Because he said the take-up rate was only 98%. And I said, who calls you? And he said, people with tinfoil on their heads or whatever. But that kind of putting the burden off the consumer, instead of here's a packet of 72 forms, and by the way, we need your tax returns, and by the way, we need you to fax this, and by the way, it's, your forms got outdated while we waited to make a decision, and now you have to start back over again. That structure was set up to fail. So it wasn't the level of help we gave Main Street that I had a problem with. It was how we delivered that help. And you contrast that to the big banks. They went in some conference room in the dark of night, a bunch of people, and they cut a deal, and they walked out, and the next day they just made it happen.
Having been there, and my job as speechwriter was to try to help explain what we were doing around the financial crisis to people. And because I did not have a background in economics, I learned a lot from, or I had to sit with Geithner and Summers and all the rest. And I just remember one situation where it was the AIG bonuses, and we weren't going to claw back the AIG bonuses. And I was like, well, we're going to have to explain this to people because we're going to have people with pitchforks coming to the White House. And Larry Summers says to me, he's like, well, it has to do with contract law. And, so because you can't claw out the bonuses because that's against the law. And
keep in mind, Larry Summers, non-lawyer.
Not a lawyer, right. But in my experience, it was a lot of people who were well-intentioned and wanted to help. But there's always these caution. There's always a reason not to do something in government. I heard, Geithner talk about how in some of the housing relief programs, the Inspector General at Treasury made it more complicated because they were worried about fraud. So there's always something that they're worried about. Do you think that Democrats and the next Democratic president have to have less technocratic people in government, less caution in general? How do you get through that?
So there's actually some really interesting research around this, including work done by Eldar Shafir, whose book Scarcity I highly recommend. And essentially what happens is he's done some studies that show when you try to crack down on fraud, say in a TANF food stamp program or a welfare program, and so you ask more questions and you add some paperwork and you create a couple layers of checks, what actually happens is fraud goes up a little bit, and the very poorest, most needy people don't apply at all.
Wow.
Because it gets too complex. So it turns out, listen, and I saw this with the mortgage crisis, cheaters, they're willing to fill out a lot of paperwork in order to cheat.
Right.
I mean, they're trying to get their home scot-free, even though they don't deserve it. They're wheeling and dealing. They'll lie to you. They'll put a lot of effort into cheating.
Yeah.
But the everyday working class person, especially someone who's doing shift work, who maybe faces a language or education barrier, they're not trying to cheat. They're just trying to get help. And so I think we have to understand that we all want the system to be fair. And that's a core impulse, and it's a good one. But when we try too hard to prevent cheaters, what we actually do is push out the most needy and the most vulnerable from these systems.
Yeah, I think there's also this public sentiment, and we wrestled with this too, which is yes, people believe that banks trick people into these mortgages that they couldn't afford and that the banks were bad actors in all of this. But there was another sentiment that we saw, and we saw this in public opinion as well, where people said, well, some people shouldn't have bought homes that they couldn't afford. And you see this now in conversations about, free college, right? Or even debt forgiveness around college, right? And people say, well, I paid my college loans, why shouldn't someone else? How do you start changing this sentiment and sort of our general ideas around debt and personal debt and household debt.
Right. So I think part of it is when we start to think about these as collective problems. And so we have this tendency in America that everything is very individual and very meritocratic, and we all kind of get what we deserve. And I talked about this. One of my powerful childhood experiences was watching the entire kind of upper Midwest get decimated by the farm crisis.
Right.
And that had nothing to do with who was a good farmer and who was a bad farmer. That had to do with economic forces and crop prices and interest rates. And so I think I come at it from a slightly different perspective. But I do think we have to start realizing that just because we suffered doesn't mean that it's beneficial to us to have the next generation suffer.
Right.
And that's not actually helpful. So, when people say to me, well, I paid off all of my college debt, I sometimes say, did you enjoy that experience? Was it helpful? Did it help you save for retirement? Like, if you hadn't had to pay off every single dollar of that, wouldn't you be in a better place now?
Right.
And so I think it's thinking about things kind of how the pieces affect each other.
Right.
And we often do a really poor job of that. And I think something that we as Democrats and we as progressives have to do a better job at talking about is we're in this collectively. And so you can tell I'm a professor because I keep referencing books, but another book that made a powerful impact on me is called Our Kids by Robert Putnam, sociologist who wrote Bowling Alone. And he talks about back in his generation, when people said, we have to do something to help our kids. We have to build a playground to help our kids. They meant the children in this country or in this state or in their town or in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so often now when people say, we have to do something about our kids, they mean theirs.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the kind of mindset that I think we've seen grow. And I think it's a problem for us ultimately.
Do you worry that mindset, we seem to have this need that we need to sort of stitch together this collective ideal of what it means to be Americans, and that our politics right now gets in the way of that? And, and some people in Washington be like, well, it's both sides. It's not both sides. But there is this notion that I wonder that if our economic ideal here, which is to have people understand that what happens to you and your finances and in your own economic matters to the rest of the country. Do you think that's, do you think our politics handles that well?
No, I don't. But I think some of this is that it goes back to something that Elizabeth Warren, I think, really famously talked about, which was, she said nobody gets rich alone, right? That we all rely on the collective infrastructure. And even if I individually have a great idea and I stay up late and I work really hard and work myself to the bone for that idea, boy, when I go to grow that company and I have to hire some employees, I'm really glad there's some people with good public educations, so that I can have smart employees. No business is going to run its own K through 12 education system, right? And so, no business funds its own airport. And so there's ways in which we all contribute to the system through taxes and through the ways that we use the system and draw on it.
How do you think we should get Medicare for All passed? What is your favorite approach to this transition? So
with regard to Medicare for All, I think one of the things we have to acknowledge is that Medicare, as it currently exists, isn't a perfect system. And I think that helps people realize that you're a realist when you're talking about it. So I often point out to people, there are some things with Medicare we'd have to change and improve as we begin to expand it. And the two examples I give are the way that the prohibition on negotiating prescription drug prices in Medicare, which if we're going to make Medicare sustainable and cost sustainable, we have to address that. And then the other is that Medicare, like pretty much every health insurance plan I've ever seen or had, does a really lousy job of how it covers and reimburses mental health care. And so I think when we talk about making sure that we're making changes to Medicare to improve that system, we shouldn't have any programs in this country that have things called donut holes in them. That's just like you've already lost when you've got something
complicated things
called a donut hole. And so somebody said the other day, well, we should call it Medicare Part E. And I thought, oh, geez,
that rolls off the tongue.
That just rolls off the tongue, right? Medicare Part E, please don't. And so I think it's understanding that we have to do some changing to Medicare to make it work, and then also thinking about some different phase-in concepts. So a lot of it, the talk has been around reducing the age, right, from 65 to 60 or from 60 to 55. I actually think we might want to go the other direction. And so putting people on as newborns, putting people on at 26 when they fall off the ACA and they're stuck, but putting younger people onto the system because the support for them is very strong. They're very interested in this system and in trying it. And so I think it's going to be a multiple year process to get there, no doubt about it.
So you're close to Elizabeth Warren. You've worked for Kamala Harris. Both of them are thinking about running for president. I'm not going to ask you to pick sides here. But in general, what kind of candidate do you think the Democratic Party should nominate in 2020? And how do you run a campaign against Donald Trump?
Oh, so I have no idea how to run a campaign against Donald Trump. I mean, that I think it's that is not that challenging of a task, I think, in some ways, because there's just so many different kinds of concerns about our presidency. And so I think we'll see different candidates lean into different aspects of Trump's leadership and lack thereof. I think, this to me, I think this election is going to be a lot like '08. I lived in Iowa in '08, was a faculty member there. And so I just remember it was a horrible winter and they kept coming by and offering us yard signs. And so the quickest way for listeners out there, if someone knocks on your door and they offer you a yard sign, like the fastest way to get someone to go away is to say, yes, we love a yard sign. And so we just kept adding yard signs and it kept snowing and then you couldn't see what happened. And then by the time the snow melted in March, well after the Iowa caucus, we had probably 15 yard signs. Apparently, we had supported Richardson and Obama and Hillary and John Edwards and fill in the blank. And so I think we're going to have a big primary process. And I think somebody who can communicate about some of these areas where I hear people say, well, that's just pretty complicated. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for someone who says, that's complicated, but here's how I think we get started thinking about it. Or that's complicated, but let's try to sort it out together. And somebody who really invites the public into those conversations. And I think that's going to be really important. How do you draw people who maybe support Trump into at least dialogue, productive dialogue with you?
You've said that Congress wasn't built for members like you. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant is I'm a single mom of 3 kids. While we've been recording this, I'm pretty sure I hear my children screaming out in your lobby.
It may be pundit barking, or maybe your kids. I can't tell, but yeah.
So it's stuff like this. It's things like, my kids are coming with me to swearing in day. And people are like, could you have a photograph, like just no children? Well, where would they be? Like, where would I put them if not in the photograph with me? And so I think there's some aspects about this that not only, by the way, are built around a 2-parent family, around your kids being older, but also, frankly, around people having personal wealth that are really challenging. And so I've been negotiating a lease for my district office, and they keep saying we want a security deposit. And that I can't access congressional funds until after I'm sworn in on January 3rd. And so I keep explaining, I can't afford a security deposit. It's Christmas time. I'm trying to buy Christmas gifts. I have a lot of expenses right now coming off the campaign. Sorry, I don't have the money for a security deposit. And so I think there are things like that I keep wondering, how do other people make this work? And the answer seems to be that they're rich, and I'm not. I'm driving a 2008 minivan, and I'm glad to have it, right? And so I think there are just some things that are baked into the system that make assumptions about kind of who goes to Congress that I think this class is going to push back at in a big way.
How do your 3 children feel about all this?
My kids were troopers on the campaign trail. I mean, people said, well, are you going to, kind of hide them? And I thought, how? Do you want to hide them? Please, let me know. We really didn't have a choice but to have them be part of the process. And we actually treated the campaign as something we did as a family. And so my kids came to a lot of events. That my son telling me at one point, Mom, kids at school are making fun of me. They're saying my mom is liberal Katie Porter. That was the big TV ad, was, liberal Katie Porter. And
I guess it could have been worse.
I said to Luke, well, hon, maybe don't wear your campaign T-shirt every day to school because I'm washing it like every day in the laundry. And he's like, I'm not doing that. I'm proud of you, Mom. Nobody can silence me. And so it was like, well, you buy the ticket, you take the ride, hon. Like, if you're going to wear the Katie Porter for Congress T-shirt to school, you're kind of inviting a conversation about Katie Porter for Congress. But they're very exciting. I will tell you that the other day it came up that I have re-election in 2 years, and my middle son said, "What? 2 years? Mom, I don't know if this is a good idea." So they definitely are learning a lot about government as we go.
Well, your bigger supporters, I'm sure. Katie Porter, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck in Congress, and please come back anytime.
Will do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.